It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week, I'm going to be talking about the sole color film of the true Universal Classic Monster series, the 1943 remake of The Phantom of the Opera. Now, there are a few things that are really interesting about this movie, and maybe one thing that I just mentioned in that previous sentence. I've talked at great length over the years and over 300 episodes of Monster Mondays about the Universal Classic Horror series. It's not only something I love quite a bit just as a fan of monster movies and the nostalgia and the sentimental fuzzies I feel from the time of my life when I was really getting into these movies and this franchise for the first time, but they are also incredibly important movies for the genre. They were mainstream horror films that had a wide-ranging appeal for audiences. They had great cast. They were usually good-looking movies. And there was also part of an early example of a word that I just used previously, which was franchise. But what really qualified for the series is debatable. And I think it's easy to say, well, of course we include Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, the Mummy, and the Invisible Man. And if for no other reason, all these characters had striking visuals to them. They had striking faces, striking visages, and generally speaking, to the exception of the Mummy, the original Mummy, the movies each had a continuity with multiple sequels. And that's the key word too, right? Sequels. Universal made a bunch of horror movies between 1931 and 1960, but those classic monsters, the characters I said all had a striking visage, well, they were usually sequelized in some way. Werewolf of London or The Mad Ghoul or Tarantula, all Universal horror movies, none of them had sequels. So when Universal was building a logo for their horror films and they chose those monsters to appear as the mascots of this line and the creatures that they could market in all sorts of ways, even up to and including having little cutesy plush stuffed animals of them, I had them all. They were wonderful. I think most of the time you got them at CVS drugstores was where I typically found them, but they were generally considered the official Universal Classic Monsters. Now, to have a little bit more representation and the fact that the film was so highly regarded, Universal added the Bride of Frankenstein, despite her appearing only in a few minutes of screen time in a singular movie. But then, due to the popularity of the creature from the Black Lagoon later in the 50s, it was decided that he would be added as the final classic monster. Sometimes, every now and then, you will see the Metaluna mutant from This Island Earth included, but he was more of a marketable visual to sell than a true Universal Classic monster. Besides, he was just a creature in a sci-fi flick. If you were to count that, then you'd have two color films in the Universal Classic Monster films, but I tend to stick to the black and white movies and then Phantom of the Opera. And more likely, you would consider the Phantom as another classic monster. And even then, typically what would be marketed would be the Lon Chaney version from 1925. This 1943 film was certainly a planned remake and update of that 1925 film and a planned color film, and was obviously trading on the popularity of the Universal monster films from the past dozen years before this or so. Now, the remake would take 8 years to finally get realized. And the first idea was to modernize the tale and make the Phantom a psychologically wounded vet from World War I. That idea was around 1935, which would have been right around the time that the Hays Code would have been implemented. And I'm curious how that would have played out if it would have gotten out before the code was added. I don't remember exactly the date that the Hays Code was released, but that could be really interesting because this Phantom was not physically scarred, but only imagined that he was ugly and disfigured. And this was from the era of Carl Laemmle and his son Carl Jr. And when Universal hit rocky times shortly after this announcement for the remake was made, the Laemmles were ousted, and the film and the entire horror genre at Universal was shelved for a few years. Then in 1941, after the success of Son of Frankenstein revitalized the horror department at Universal, new plans surfaced. This new plan was to make Christine not the object of desire for the Phantom, but his daughter. And initially, the Phantom was going to be played by Boris Karloff. And after Karloff was no longer available, other names to be considered for the Phantom were Cesar Romero, Charles Laughton, and Broderick Crawford. But the filmmaker behind this version, Henry Koster, was fired, and that brings us to the final version that became this movie. Arthur Lubin was hired, and he went back to a more traditional version of the story, set in the past. It was a period piece. They even actually used the same set, the same studio set that the 1925 version was filmed on. That was that stood for years and years and years and decades before it was finally torn down and renovated. But he immediately cast Claude Rains, and by this time, Rains was an Oscar-nominated actor for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and twice appeared in other hits for Universal as the Invisible Man and as Larry Talbot's father in The Wolf Man. And this is the same year that Rains would appear in Casablanca also, which would be his second Oscar nomination. So pretty good year for Claude Rains. Now, speaking of Larry Talbot, we'll be circling back around to Lon Chaney Jr. in just a moment. Nelson Eddy, star of musicals as it was, had been attached to this remake for a few years by this time. And when he was finally able to become available after ending a contract at another studio, he was snapped up by Universal for a couple of movies on a contract. And this was one of those movies that it was going to be planned that he would be starring in. Also, we have 18-year-old Susanna Foster cast as Christine. And she looks so much older than 18, not so much older than 18, but she certainly does not look that young, but it is a perfect age and a perfect casting for the part of Christine, all things considered, about her being an up-and-coming opera singer, somebody that whose youth and vitality is kind of lusted after by the various characters in the story. So pretty good idea to cast somebody actually kind of age appropriate. Now, while the film was received with mixed reviews upon release, the studio had a plan for a sequel called The Climax, and Universal wanted to bring Foster and Eddy back, and it was to also feature Rains again, revealing that the Phantom survived the end of this movie. That would ultimately be reworked into another movie called The Climax, which ended up starring Boris Karloff, who was initially sought after the play The Phantom. And the only remaining cast member of that original sequel plan was Foster herself. Now, I do want to talk about two things about this film that is often thought of as, I guess, kind of negatives in the eyes of a lot of people. First, this movie kind of actually is more of a musical. I struggle to say necessarily that it is truly an outright musical, but there is definitely a much higher presence of a musical format to this movie. And while the story of the Phantom of the Opera by default is kind of musical in nature because, well, it's a phantom haunting an opera house and doing shenanigans while operas are going on, the 1925 version of the film elevated the horror element of this creepy guy who lives under the opera house in Paris and pines for the young starlet Christine to the point of obsession and kidnapping. And it was also a silent movie. They could only do so much with audio at that point. So yes, it does have a constant score under that movie. But this really kind of leans much more heavily into the opera element of the tale. And this would, I believe, be the first time the story was presented as more of a musical. The stage musical that we know of today began with actually Ken Hill in 1976, who had produced a Phantom of the Opera musical. And then later, the much more popular and revered 1986 version by Andrew Lloyd Webber. But then there was later again, it was adapted by Maury Yeston and Arthur Coppett in 1991, just called The Phantom. But fans of the Universal horror films don't much care for the heavy lean into the musical element that this movie goes for. And I think it is a little short-sighted to simply say this movie has a musical problem, being that it is a story that deals with, opera singers, like I said. I don't know. But the other thing that has a little bit of a drag on this movie's reputation is that by the time this film was in production, Lon Chaney Jr. was a big hit for Universal with The Wolfman. He was a loyal Universal contract player throughout the rise of his stardom, and for about 10 years. And he was upset that he was not once considered to play the role his father made one of the most famous monsters in the history of film. It's said that when his Wolfman co-star Claude Rains took the role of the Phantom, Chaney Jr. resented Rains for the rest of his life. And I can kind of understand this to a certain extent. It is something of a legacy for the son who is now a famous monster guy himself at that point in time. But I kind of also can't blame anybody for wanting to choose Rains. A little bit more on why I think that's the case a little bit later. But let's get into this colorful version of the Phantom of the Opera. And this movie opens with a grand performance of an opera starring Anatole Garon and up-and-coming actress Christine Dubois. Stalking around backstage, we meet Inspector Raoul Dubert, who, like Anatole, seeks to become a suitor of Christine's. You see, Raoul would like for Christine to quit the opera business and marry him. And meanwhile, Anatole props Christine up and compliments her, believing that she really does have real talent, that if she just gets her chance, she's going to be a big star. Now, between the stage director and conductor, they would like Christine to spend more time paying attention to her work at the Paris Opera House than her fling with this policeman. But as Christine seems to be loaded with suitors all over the place, we then meet Enrique Claudin. Now, he's a violinist and an aspiring composer, and he's the one played by Claude Rains. He is losing the use of his left hand, and it's affecting how he can play the violin, and the conductor of the Paris Opera House has spotted that he's struggling. Now, due to the reputation of the Opera House, Claudin is fired, and Claudin later, he's really kind of reveals that he's living a bachelor life, and he's really not able to support himself without consistent work. You see, he does make a good pay as a musician in the opera house, but he's been secretly funding voice lessons with a really expensive singing coach for Christine. It kind of feels like we're only a few minutes into this movie, and Christine has more suitors than most people have shoes. But all is not quite so lost for Claudin, though. He's composed pieces of music that he hopes to get published so that he could get those sold. And one of these is a piano concerto. Now, Claudin later goes to get his concerto, to check in on that concerto to see if it's going to be published or if he can collect it from the publisher and try again. But he's kind of dismissed rudely by the guy who runs the publishing house. However, he ends up hearing that his music is being played, and it's being played by real-life musician Franz Liszt, who believes that this music is beautiful and wants to urge the publisher to buy it and publish it, and for him to help kind of get it spread across the country and across Europe. But in a roundabout way, this leads to Claudin believing that the rude publisher has stolen his music and given it to somebody else, or allowing somebody else to take credit for it. And this ends up to him throttling the publisher, killing him. But the publisher's assistant throws etching acid onto Claudine's face, which disfigures him. Police chase after the scarred musician, trying to apprehend him for the murder of the publisher, but he escapes into the sewers under Paris. Now, later it's discovered that a costume from the prop room has been stolen, as have food having gone missing from the opera house concessions kitchen, I suppose. But later, Raoul comes to speak to Christine about Claudine to find out what his personality was like. Who was this guy? And Anatole is with her while she's questioned. And Raoul reveals a bust of Christine that was found with Claudine's belongings. And Anatole reveals that it was his bust that he made from memory of Christine's face, basically, to present to her as a gift. Now, clearly, both Anatole and Raoul attempt to win the young singer's heart, but she doesn't really seem romantically into either one of them. Now, she's close to them, and she appreciates their attention, but she's not exactly willing to choose one over the other. They kind of provide different concepts of a life to her. Like, you have the policeman who's very strict and kind of gives her order a little bit. And you have the baritone in Anatole who kind of props her up from an artist perspective. So, but anyway, later, as the next performance is gearing up, a shadowy figure is seen wandering around the dressing area and the backstage area. The shadow speaks to Christine to tell her that she's going to become a great singer and that he will help her. She doesn't know who that is, but later, that same shadowy person drugs a glass of wine for the prima donna to drink and fall unconscious, presenting Christine the opportunity to step into the lead of the opera for the second act, and her performance becomes a massive hit. Now, Christine is an overnight star. Anatole is ecstatic that the girl he's after kind of hit the big time, and Claudine sees all of his machinations play out. However, the prima donna, Mademoiselle Biancaroli, believes that Anatole and Christine was behind the drugging, and Raoul is hesitant to accept the prima donna's accusation and make an arrest. After all, he doesn't really have any evidence other than hearsay. The head of the opera house convinces her to drop the accusation because any kind of controversy at the opera house can affect everyone, including her. She says that she will do that on one simple condition. Christine is put back in the chorus, and the prima donna gets a new understudy for the final 2 years of her contract. This does not go over well for the Phantom, and he kills Biancaroli and flees the dressing room area with Anatole in pursuit, but the Phantom is able to slip him and escape. The opera is closed, but the Phantom leaves a note saying that they must reopen and Christine must become the new prima donna, and if not, there will be more danger and murder and chaos. Now, while the head of the opera house believes this would be a good idea because, well, if the Phantom sticks to his word, there won't be any further death or spooks if they capitulate to the demand. But Raoul actually disagrees. His duty is to apprehend the murderer. Giving him what he wants will likely keep him hiding forever. Resisting the demand will bring the Phantom out. Raoul will post cops all over the place to ensure the safety of the performers and for greater opportunity to capture the Phantom. And Anatole has an idea. He's going to enlist Liszt to play the music that Claudine tried to sell to the publisher. That might draw him out of hiding to avert any more further murder. He's brought to the opera house to play the piano concerto after the opera concludes. And when the Phantom does not get what he wants and another woman is selected to sing the lead for this opera on this night, he climbs up to the large chandelier hanging over the audience and begins sawing at the chain, keeping it aloft. Once it falls, In the resulting madness and chaos, Claudine nabs Christine and goes under the opera house with her. He tells her that he loves her and that she will be able to sing all she wants, but now it's only going to be for him. Anatole and Raoul follow. Soon Liszt plays Claudine's piano concerto, which causes him to play along with it. And Christine realizes that this concerto is based around a lullaby both she and Claudine knew from where they grew up, outside of Paris. When Claudine is distracted by the music, Christine sneaks up and does that classic Phantom of the Opera thing and removes his mask to see Claudine's scarred and disfigured face. Raoul and Anatole burst into the underground lair. Raoul plans to shoot Claudine, but Anatole bumps his arm so that he shoots up into the ceiling in an already crumbling underground mausoleum of sorts. That creates a cave-in that crushes Claudine. As the movie ends, Christine suitors the man that she chooses one of them, Raoul or Anatole. She chooses neither, so that she can instead focus on her career. And, well, now that she's a star, she has the adoration of many, many more people than just these two guys. Raoul and Anatole decide, they've become pretty good friends after all of this, so they decide to go grab a bite to eat together instead of with her. Let's pick 3 things I like about 1943's The Phantom of the Opera. First, the color production is rather lavish. While most of the Universal monster classics preceding this film were always well shot and well designed from an art direction standpoint, this movie looks every bit the nearly $2 million budget. It's obvious that Universal was separating this movie from their other monster films to turn this more into a straightforward drama for an older audience, I believe. I wouldn't be terribly surprised if Universal thought this would either be a major monetary hit, which it really kind of wasn't, or a possible award contender. Now, everything from the set design to the set decorations to the costuming is above and beyond for this production. Then, its color, with the warmer hue to the color grading, it's a warm and alive movie. Indeed, this film was nominated for 4 Oscars. It won for color art direction and color cinematography. So that lines right up with what I was praising. And it was also nominated for Best Score and Best Sound Recording. Now, speaking about the score, my next like is that I really do like the tilt toward the musical element of this movie. While it really isn't technically a musical, music is a massive influence on the plot. I mean, there are scenes from the opera as well as moments in which Christine is singing with Anatole or with her coach. There really isn't a situation in which the movie stops to have a musical moment. It's woven into the story and should really make sense that this movie would feature those musical elements. After all, this is Phantom of the Opera, not Phantom of the Spooky Catacombs only, and never the opera, or never will play music in the opera in which the Phantom haunts. I mean, this is Phantom of the Opera. Come on. But much with how the color production and sets make the film warm and alive, the music gives it alive too. It helps add a little extra emotion to the general story as a whole. Now, thirdly, I think this movie does a good job of making you feel a lot of sympathy for the Phantom. And I also think it helps by casting Claude Rains as the character. I know, Lon Chaney Jr., this is kind of your family thing, but Rains is really kind of perfect because he does have a nice, kind look to him. In this movie, he comes across as this lonely man who is in love with a young starlet, but has no real way of winning her over. I mean, he's 48 years old. They make mention of that very specifically. He's 48 years old and she's young. Like I said, the actress playing her is 30 years the character's junior. So I imagine she was no older than 20. But he's really just kind of a simple violinist with limited talent to write music. Naturally, Claude Rains' voice is marvelous, so that helps him as the Phantom as well. But if we were to think of the Phantom as a lonely misfit, unable to really know what to do of himself, but pine after this pretty soprano, the 1925 film was more interested in the Beauty and the Beast element by making the Phantom ugly and mean while still loving Christine. Here, he's much more of a put upon man without a great deal of luck in his life. He spends all of his money to help Christine become a star and to get her voice trained for her big moment when she finally does become a star. He lives in a tiny apartment that is kind of ramshackle and kind of bare. He's soft-spoken. And as Nelson Eddy's Anatole says at one point, that, this guy is inoffensive in just about every way. So much so, he is barely noticed in life. He's likable in this movie, and I think that helps. And he's pushed to make a bad decision at the publishers, and because he's desperate. And then he later, after being disfigured, goes insane to the point that he kills more willfully. But he was, at one point, at heart, a good guy. This is kind of one of those scenarios that Universal was so good at, making the monster more human than he appears. More often than not, you could find yourself kind of sympathizing with the poor fella cursed or disfigured or reanimated by a mad scientist. Enrique Claudin is no exception and maybe one of the more sympathetic guys in the Universal Monster stable. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, we go from one of the classic monster films made in the 40s to an obscure 80s sci-fi monster movie. Whether you call it Mutant 2, The Falling, Alien Predator, or Alien Predators, it's what's next for Monster Mondays. So until next week, stay spooky.